Today's guests are looking to win your vote in the upcoming Vancouver municipal election for City Council. Running under the political party of COPE, which is the Coalition for Progressive Electors, I welcome incumbent City Councillor Jean Swanson and former Coastal Front guest Breen Ouellette to our municipal elections series. Jean was first elected to council in 2018, but she's been playing the anti-poverty, social justice ground game for over 4 decades. Her accomplishments include working with residents of the Vancouver's downtown east side to protect low-income housing and improve living conditions. She co-authored annual reports on the single-room occupancy, hotel stock, and rentals. And, interesting, she was the COPE NDP Unity candidate for mayor in Vancouver in 1988. Fellow candidate Breen is a proud Métis, a recently new father, activist, and lawyer with a long list of achievements, including being one of the Commission Council lawyers for the National Inquiry into Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which we talked about in our last podcast. Breen was also a consultant for the recent Coming Home report for the city of Saskatoon, which convinced their council to establish an independent representative of matriarchs to protect Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Okay, so we want to start by letting the listeners to our podcast know a little bit about yourselves individually and about COPE. So, Jean, why don't we start with yourself? Maybe you can spend a couple minutes just telling people who you are, for those who may not know who you are.
Yeah, well, I'm a city councillor now for almost 4 years. Before that, I was volunteering at the Carnegie Community Action Project, working for better housing, higher welfare rates, and to slow down or stop gentrification in the downtown east side. Before that, I was taking care of my grandson, and I wrote a book called Poor Bashing, The Politics of Exclusion. And I worked with a group called End Legislated Poverty for a number of years, was active in the anti-free trade movement. I worked for the Hospital Employees Union, and way back in the 70s, I worked at the Downtown East Side Residents Association with Bruce Erickson and Libby Davies.
Wow.
Who old codgers like me will remember.
That's quite the history. I imagine that the Downtown East Side's changed quite a bit from the 1970s.
Yeah, it has changed. It's back in those days, there was only about, I would say, 1/10 as many homeless people.
Is that right?
Because back in those days, welfare rates were high enough to eat and pay the rent. And governments were building lots of social housing. And in those days, even poor people could afford social housing. Nowadays, poor people can't afford most social housing. So wow. There were strong government policies that caused the downtown east side to be in better shape in the 70s than it is now.
Well, we're going to spend some time talking about that because I know that's very important to you. Bree, maybe about you for the listeners who haven't met you before, let's hear a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, I'm a Métis person originally from Saskatchewan. I come from a long line of notable Métis people. 2 of my ancestors, my third great grandfather and my third great grandmother on different lines, are notable for. My third great grandfather was in the battle at Batoche in 1885, and he died in the final hours of the battle because he was laying down suppressing fire so the other Métis combatants could escape. And he took a bayonet in the stomach at 93 years of age and died on the hill. And my third great grandmother, Marguerite Madeleine Trottier, is notable because she's one of the very few people in history to have been scalped and survive. And she was scalped at 17 years of age, and she lived to be 85. My great grandfather George William fought in the Boer War, and he wore a 45 on his hip until the day he died. And my great uncle Harold was a paratrooper in World War II. And his record is still classified, so we don't know exactly what he was up to, but it was apparently pretty important. And my grandfather Laird was a world champion dog mushing racer, and he won the world championship in the Pas Manitoba in 1952 and 1958 and raced dogs all across Canada and the United States.
Wow.
So
you've got, basically the point is you've got big shoes to fill here.
Yes,
Okay.
Exactly.
Now the reason, for those listeners who may not know, the reason you were in our studios and we interviewed a couple of years ago, maybe it was even 3 years ago now, you were running under the federal NDP against Hetty Fry, and you weren't obviously successful. I mean, that's a tough one to win with Hetty. Yeah. What have you done since then?
Well, I ran against her again in 2021.
Okay.
And we gained some more ground, built some really strong support in the West End and the rest of the Vancouver Centre riding. It was actually quite remarkable because we only had a 6-week campaign on that one, and we managed to raise $100,000. So there's an appetite for change down in Vancouver Centre. It's just going to take a little more runway for a campaign to make it happen. Yeah. And then, I'm a lawyer. I was a lawyer with the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And as you said in the intro, I assisted on a report to the city of Saskatoon, which resulted in them this year allocating the budget to begin rolling out the representative for matriarchs in Saskatoon, which is a really interesting change in the way that cities can handle issues involving Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, and I'll talk about that more. Yeah. And then I'm doing other things in my law practice. I can't talk about all of them, obviously, because of client solicitor client privilege. Yeah. But
practicing law.
Practicing law, okay. And I've got one I can talk about a tiny bit. I'm doing an RCMP complaint for a former witness at the National Inquiry.
Okay. So, yeah. Okay. Good. Well, that's good intro for both of you. Let's talk about COPE for a moment, and you've obviously been involved with COPE for many years, Jean. For those listeners who aren't familiar with COPE, this is the Coalition for Progressive Electors. Can you talk a bit about your organization more broadly and what it represents for this upcoming election?
Yeah, I got involved in COPE back in the 70s when Harry Rankin was on City Council for COPE. And I was working at the Downtown Eastside Residents Association, and we always said Harry was on the inside and we were on the outside. So when we had something we wanted City Hall to do, we'd go to Harry and he would do it for us. Like I remember once there was a bunch of stores that were selling rubbing alcohol as a beverage. And so we called up the city and complained, oh, you can't crack down on these, please. And the city response was, oh, it's not a problem. So I went and collected a whole bunch of empty rubbing alcohol bottles around the neighborhood in a big garbage bag, took them up to Harry's committee. In those days, they had committee, spilled them all out on the table. And said, yes, we do have a problem with rubbing alcohol being sold as a beverage. And then his committee basically cracked down on those stores and stopped it. So that's just one example. We got a standards of maintenance bylaw, it says cockroaches are illegal and things like that. And that was because of his work. And we'd call him up, he'd come down and check things out, and then we could get. So I always wanted to be that kind of a council person. I wanted to be somebody on the inside who could work with people like he worked with people on the outside.
Okay.
And COPE has been doing that kind of stuff for 50 years. And we were born out of the Vancouver District Labour Council. When I ran for mayor in 1988, I was the Labour Council candidate. And, COPE was responsible or really pushed for and obtained the nuclear weapons free zone back in the 80s when everyone was fighting nuclear weapons. And some of those signs are still around.
They are, yeah.
Yeah. And that was part of a big push worldwide to try and, push senior governments to not blow us all up. So COPE has been working for things like that, rent control, helping lower income people, helping working people, that kind of thing.
Okay, great.
50 years.
For 50 years, okay. And the two of you are 2 of 4 people running under the city council slate, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm thrilled with our candidates this
year. So we obviously have Breen and yourself. Who are the other two?
Tanya Webb King, she's another Indigenous person, and Nancy Trigueros, who is from Mexico, and has really been involved heavily in trying to make things better for immigrants.
Okay, good. Sounds like a good powerhouse team.
And Tanya is really involved in tenant movement.
Okay. Well, that's a good segue into the first topic, which is about renters' protection and housing. Now, Jean, you've been an anti-poverty activist. As you pointed out earlier, you wrote a book called Poor Bashing. So that I'm going to check that out after we do this conversation. And you've dedicated...
It's in the library.
Is it? Okay. And for decades, you've been dedicated to social issues such as renters' protection, rent controls, workers' rights, and safe supply. First question for you. Do you think that the current council has the same drive that you do to campaign for these types of issues?
No.
Okay. I kind of figured you'd say no. So if not, why not?
They represent different interests. You know, some of them are on there, they represent business more than I do. I'm more working for the little guy, right? They're working more for business. I was at a meeting the other night. There was a motion to allow businesses to serve alcohol at night in certain places where they're not allowed. And one of the councillors said, "Oh, it's always nice to go out and have a cocktail after you've worked late." And I thought, oh my God, I have never gone out and had a cocktail after I worked late. I don't think anybody that I know, none of the people I hang out with in the first place, until now that I'm a rich city councillor making 93 grand a year, I didn't have the money to go out and have a cocktail after work.
Right.
But it's a different life, and I'm not there to represent that life so much. I don't want the people in that life to have a bad time. If they have an individual problem or something, I'll try and solve it or work towards a solution for it.
Yeah.
But mostly I'm focused on folks that are in the middle or below the middle in terms of income.
Okay.
And also people of color, racialized people, trying to make sure they get a good deal.
Okay, that's good. Okay, well, thank you for that. With respect to, now your answer was no as far as the council of a whole, but are there any city councillors that you currently work with you're quite well aligned? Like, are there any in particular that you find you are able to work with on a lot of things?
Well, I can work. I'm big on climate. I think we really need to get our greenhouse gas emissions down to 50% by 2030, and we need to do more actually, because we're not going to meet our targets at the current rate. And so I work with the Greens and One City on that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Broadway Plan, on June 9th, we expected council to vote, and as of today, the 16th, when we're filming here, the 16th of June, there's still been no vote. With all the rhetoric coming around the mayor regarding renters' protections, do you believe him and do you believe in him with respect to this view of renters' protections?
Well, I don't believe in people.
Okay.
I believe in a policy that would work. And I think the policy that he's put forward, that people in existing apartments should have the right to go into a new apartment if they're evicted at the same rate. I think that's a good policy. I don't think it's good enough.
Okay.
I've already made an amendment to strengthen it, and I intend to make some more amendments to strengthen.
And what would be an example of that? What were one of the amendments that you made to strengthen it?
The one that I made, I'm last on the queue, so a lot of them I haven't made yet. But
I see.
So mine was an amendment to his amendment, which is why it took so long.
Okay.
Which was basically that so that people could get into apartments of the same size that they were leaving.
Okay.
So there's a lot of people in the Broadway Plan area that have relatively cheap apartments that are big, like a 600 square foot one bedroom. So say they get a rent top up, move to another place, wait for the new building to be built, then move into the new building. Are they just going to get a one bedroom that's like 450 square feet?
Right.
So
that's valid.
I don't want that. So
Yeah.
my motion was to try and stop that.
Now, this Broadway plan is a 30-year plan. I mean, it's not something meant to just happen over the next 18 months. How can voters and councillors buy into an idea that developers who agree now to protecting renters' rights will still be in agreement in that 5, 10, and 15 years from now?
The way the city does that is they have housing agreements.
Okay.
And most of the housing agreements say that they last for 60 years of the life of the building, whichever is longer.
Oh, really?
So if you have a housing agreement, if you have a rule that says 20% of the housing has to be at 20% below CMHC, or you have a rule that says the tenants who are done evicted get to come at their same rate, that would be enshrined in a housing agreement
Okay.
for 60 years of the life of the building.
Okay. This concept of affordable housing, is it really achievable here in Vancouver, Jean?
It could be if we had lots of, the cheapest, fastest thing we could do would be to preserve the affordability that we already have.
Okay.
And that would be to have vacancy control. Vacancy control would be a law that landlords can't raise the rents as much as they like when tenants leave. We have that now.
Vacancy control.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the idea that Breen's my renter. I'm a landlord. He leaves. Right now, once he's gone, I can jack the rent up to whatever I want, and then you come along as a new renter, and you've got to say he's paying it, for simple math, he's paying $1,500. I can raise it to $2,000. And what you're proposing is that I'm capped as to how much I can raise it by, so that as a new renter, you're not having to pay that huge spike in rental costs.
Yeah.
Have I got that right?
Yeah, and CMHC does surveys of rentals in Vancouver, and they find that apartments that are for rent are renting for a lot more than apartments that are rented. And every year the amount goes up. So every year we're losing affordability in 10, 20,000 units every year. So if we had vacancy control, that could solve that problem, and it would be relatively cheap. Be way cheaper than building a new social housing unit, which is expensive. You've got to buy the land, you've got to pay for the construction.
Yeah.
So vacancy control is the first thing. We have it in SRO hotels. There is a big problem with investor landlords buying up the hotels, booting out the existing low-income tenants so they could raise the rents as much, double, triple the rents. We have it now, and I'm hoping that we can expand that to the rest of the city after the next election.
Okay.
So that's the first thing about housing. Then, we have this huge homeless problem.
Yes.
We need to have more housing that people who are low-income people can afford. How do you get the money for that? COPE has been advocating for a progressive property tax. In order to get that, we need a change in the city charter by the province. But we need to, the first stage in getting something is to ask for it. So I think we need to, build up a really strong campaign, ask for a progressive property tax. Then we could tax people who own mansions at a higher rate than people that own, say, a $400,000 condo.
Okay.
We get more money. We could put it into, I'd put it into ending homelessness, and then start putting it into building housing that lower income renters can afford. Okay,
that's good. And I do have a question on your mansion tax later on, but this is a great segue into the topic of homelessness. Now, the city of Vancouver has been buying up these hotels to house the homeless. Examples include Days Inn on Kingsway, the Best Western in Mount Pleasant, the Biltmore Hotel, and the former Ramada Hotel. Now, housing alone is not enough, though. If you look at a lot of these people, they need what it's described as wraparound services. So how do you go about accomplishing that? Is that a responsibility of this city government, or is this something that should be passed on to the provincial or federal government?
Traditionally, the city has provided the land, the province provides some construction costs and operation costs, and the feds provide construction and or acquisition costs, which they provided some of the money for those hotels that you just listed off.
Okay.
So that's the way it goes. In my opinion.
That's historically.
Yeah.
What is it like today?
And that's basically what's happening now.
Okay, so it's not changed in your view.
The city does provide grants to nonprofits to increase the affordability of the units that they're providing. In my opinion, if we could get housing for people, and they wouldn't have experienced homelessness I think homelessness creates the need for the services.
I see.
Because it's so awful being homeless.
Right.
People have told me, for example, that the women have told me that they use upper drugs so that they won't be raped while they're sleeping on the street.
I see.
So if you can get housing for people, then they don't have to deal with these mental health issues.
Right.
You don't need all these services. So I think once we get to housing, things will calm down a bit. We won't need so many services. But
Okay,
as
that's
it
an
is now,
interesting
some
philosophy.
people need services.
Yeah.
Sometimes the housing that is provided with all these services is too institutional for people. It's kind of like, I've heard them describe it as jail.
Okay.
They can't have their relatives visit, things like that. They can't have their kids visit sometimes. So I know there are people in the community that are working on a different model of management so that you can have different models that suit everybody.
Yeah.
Maybe one that's more tenant run, one that does have all these strict rules, and then some that are more, that don't have any supports but are just housing that low income people can afford.
Right.
Because if you're on welfare, you're getting 900 and some. If you're on disability, you're getting 1,100 and some. You can't rent.
Yeah. How do you
and
get by on that? Yeah.
So that's the other thing is welfare rates or social assistance rates, welfare and disability. They're so low that they've created the need for the provincial and federal governments to build these whole new categories of housing to serve these people.
Right.
Whereas back in the day when I was on welfare in the 70s, you could just rent a place like anybody else. Right.
To finish off on our conversation around housing, being a bit of a free market activist myself, or believe in what the free market does, isn't it just simply a matter of supply and demand? Like, I mean, if we just allowed builders to just build and create more, housing, wouldn't that fix a lot of the issues?
I've heard builders on CBC radio saying, we cannot build for anyone making less than $75,000 a year.
Okay.
So your free market stuff might work for people making $75,000 a year, but
So,
the median renter household makes $50,000.
Right. That's a good point. So one of the things we've heard from builders a lot, we've talked to a lot of prominent builders who, none of them's, interesting, will want to come on camera to say this because they're worried about the blowback on getting their projects approved. So they only talk to us privately. Basically tell us that, the part of the big problem is that it takes so long to get projects approved through city hall, not necessarily because of council, right?
They're always griping about that.
Yeah.
The city is trying to work on it.
But it is a real problem.
Permitting times have gone down, but I am big on keeping the inspections for life safety things and not so big on inspections for, how pretty it is or
right.
Aesthetic things. And I think we could cut some.
Yeah, the standards are just like so insanely high. I mean, I can only speak to my own personal experience of trying to get a simple permit in Vancouver versus Saanich on Vancouver Island where my folks live. And there's a difference of like 4 months waiting for a full building permit versus like a year and a half.
But permitting time could eke up the affordability a little bit, but it's not going to end homelessness.
Okay.
It's not going to get housing for people making 30 or 40 or 50,000 a year.
Fair point.
We need government money for that.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, you seem like a great activist to have people, those people who are in those categories to be having you on their side.
And builders build housing for lower income people too. You hire the contractors; they're the ones that build it, so they can make a profit from it.
Right. Good point. So okay, now we're going to pivot to yourself, Breen, reconciliation. Let me just start by saying, as we did our last interview, some of my questions may come across as being silly. They're not. They're genuine questions. So I don't mean to offend anybody if I don't say the right wording or form the question the right way. I just want to be really clear on that because I am here to learn. Reconciliation, according to the dictionary, is restoration of friendly relations. Historically, I would not classify Canada's history with the Indigenous people as being very friendly. And I think most people would agree with that. Why do you think we use the word reconciliation the way we do?
Well, you know what? It's really interesting that you use the word reconciliation, because there's the common understanding that most of us are going on. And then there's the Supreme Court of Canada's definition of reconciliation, which goes back to a dissenting opinion in the 90s that was adopted as the majority opinion in the Haida decision in 2004. And that their definition, the highest court of Canada's definition of reconciliation, is that Indigenous people were here first. They were rightfully in control of the land. And the Crown has de facto control of the land, which means they don't have legal control, but they have factual control through the military, essentially, through occupancy. And the Supreme Court of Canada says reconciliation is making those two things work together. And as that has continued to develop, it's more and more becoming about assimilation 2.0. The Supreme Court of Canada is essentially trying to legitimize Canada's illegal control of the territory. So they've admitted it, but now they're trying to make it the state of affairs in Canada. That's very different than what you and I think reconciliation is. So when I hear the government of Canada talking about reconciliation, I know as a lawyer what they're talking about is not what we're thinking about. And so not only have there been problems historically, there are still a lot of problems today in Canada that are coming from the Canadian government trying to maintain its de facto control instead of moving forward in a more, in a less adversarial way, in a more cooperative way, recognizing, that the history really didn't work out the way it was promised. Back when treaties were signed, Indigenous nations were looking at it as, we're going to share this land, and the prosperity of the settler communities that are coming is going to be shared with us. They're going to teach us, education was part of the treaties. They're going to teach us about what they know so that we can pass that kind of, that benefit on to our children. Instead, what did we get? We got Indigenous people put on reserves, on a pass system, right? Illegal to vote in Canada until the 1950s, illegal to hire the services of a lawyer until the 1950s. There's still 50% of children in child welfare today are Indigenous. We talked about that in 2019, and how the economics of it is that the federal government transfers money to the provinces, so the provinces are encouraged to apprehend more Indigenous children so they can get more money flowing into provincial coffers.
Unreal.
Yeah. So the government is a serious problem when it comes to reconciliation. I think if you and I and average people were doing it based on that dictionary definition, we'd be in a lot better spot than we are right now.
Okay, well, it seems then that what you're saying is you're at least embrace that philosophy, the one that's not this this legal, Supreme Court definition, but the one that we've got here out of the dictionary. The idea of restoring friendly relations.
I agree with the dictionary definition, and I also agree with the definitions coming out of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. If we were going by international law instead of Canada's domestic law, which is built to benefit the existing infrastructure, the existing order. Yeah. If we were going by international courts, a lot of things would change in this country very quickly, along similar lines to how things changed in South Africa very quickly in the 90s when apartheid was abandoned by that country.
Okay, good. Well, on that note, in 2014, COPE adopted policies advocating for Indigenous representation at the municipal level. Can you expand a bit more on what these policies are?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the ways that we can have more representation at the municipal level is by, for instance, going back to the city of Saskatoon and their adoption of the representative for matriarchs. The way that works is it's an independent position that reports directly to city council, And she, because it's specifically set up as a woman, since it's the position is to deal with Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, she would have the ability to investigate complaints from the public against any department, including the police. And if she finds the complaint is justified, she can make recommendations which are delivered to City Council through a public reporting process. So it's all transparent. It's all about accountability of City Council. They're told this is happening. This is a recommendation on how we can change it. Then City Council has to deal with it or not. And then they're owning it, right? They're owning the decision not to do something about it. When working on the report and I made that, helped to develop that recommendation, I didn't think that the city of Saskatoon would go forward with it because politicians don't like accountability most of the time. Let's be honest, right? Yeah. But more accountable government is better government.
Yeah.
And they went with it, and it's fantastic. And Jean's been trying to get me to run in municipal government for 2 years, and
now you're here.
And now I'm here because I saw in that moment when I got the phone call that it had been adopted, we can do this. Cities can do really amazing things if they've got the people in there that want to make it happen. Yeah. We need innovators at City Hall.
And citizens can help by electing Breen.
Right. Good. There's the plug.
Tanya.
Fair enough.
There's a good plug. I don't remember if it was yourself, Amanda, or David Evie, but it was one of the two of you who told me about this idea that that we get really passionate about federal politics, but at the end of the day, it's what affects you the most are what happens in the municipal government.
The city is closest to the people.
The city's closest to people. I like that. Breen, if you were to give the city of Vancouver a report card on how they've done as far as achieving reconciliation, not at that Supreme Court definition, but by your view of reconciliation, what grade would you give the city today?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not keen on grades, and the reason is,
Okay, how about a thumbs up, thumbs down, or sideways?
It's probably, depending on the department. It's somewhere between a thumbs down and a sideways.
Okay.
When we're talking about the police department, it's a thumbs down. It's a big thumbs down on so many levels. When we're talking about the city's commitment to reconciliation, I like that. I like the language. I like the intent behind it. But
is it kind of like greenwashing? I mean, is it just?
I think what it is unless you're a lawyer, you're probably hearing for the first time this legal definition of reconciliation, and I'm not sure that many councillors at City Hall understand that distinction, and so they may just be rolling out that other definition of reconciliation.
Okay. Well, my tie-in question to this was going to be what areas within the city, the city's parameters of reconciliation could they make improvements on? It sounds to me like you would say number one is within the police force.
Yeah, the police force needs to be more directly accountable. It's funny.
What are some big things you would change?
You mentioned off the top that
the city doesn't control the police, though.
Yeah,
that's a big problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the city doesn't have a lot of control over the police, and in BC, there's less municipal oversight of police than in other provinces.
Okay.
So we can talk about the financial aspect of that later in a minute. But one of the big things for me, I'm in the labor movement, but I don't believe that police unions are unions. I actually believe that based on the way the courts treat the police and talk about the police in court decisions, that they should be regulated by the same as lawyers, as a professional association, and they should be licensed. And when police do things like arrest former judges because they're black and match a description and it's completely ridiculous, they should be going before a review board to determine whether or not they should be licensed as police.
Okay.
If they're off, wearing certain symbols on their uniforms, which they deny are hate symbols, but for which there is a long known history of those symbols representing white supremacy, then they should be going before a review board. And I think some police officers would lose the license to be police.
Okay.
And that would be a good thing. People
So
have said
those are some neat ideas around police. But as you pointed out, Gina, and I didn't really realize. Thank you for educating us that if you're a city councillor, you don't really get to decide how the police are run. So you get elected as city council, Breen. What are some things you would immediately do to try and help improve reconciliation at the municipal level?
Well, I mean, Vancouver needs an independent representative for matriarchs, the same as Saskatoon.
Okay.
This should be a nationwide thing.
Okay.
It immediately increases transparency, but also the other thing that office can do, there are a number of things the office does, and one of them is she can act as an intermediary or as a witness or an intervener in court processes. So oftentimes children are taken into foster care on a pretense because of the financial motivation. And one of the reasons for the representative in Saskatoon is so that she can create a diversion process essentially to prevent that from happening. And she can go into courts and explain to judges why child welfare is acting not in the best interests of children when they're taking children into foster care.
Okay, Breen. So carrying on with this concept of having a Olympic Games here in 2030, that's it's kind of wrapped around the idea of reconciliation. I know Councillor Hardwick proposed that we should be putting this idea of having the Olympic Games on a plebiscite in this upcoming election. Are you in favor of this, where voters of Vancouver should decide whether there's another Winter Olympics here, or should this be left to city council members, mayors, and the Indigenous community?
Well, this is a tension that happens in politics all the time, and it's a well-known phenomenon. It's called tyranny of the majority, and because Indigenous peoples don't form the majority in Canada, they don't form the majority in Vancouver. Democratic processes tend to create hardship on Indigenous peoples, and governments try to balance that through social programs, through human rights legislation. And so the plebiscite could very well end up denying Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations the ability to put in a bid that they, for all the signs right now, they're very committed to it. They really want to see this happen. We need to, I think we need to see what they're proposing and what the options are on the table, at least before considering a plebiscite. But, the hard part for government is, at what point does a plebiscite just act to reinforce past injustices? It's not an easy question, that's for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've often thought that when I've observed, especially in the last say 4 or 5 years, I've observed this development of reconciliation at the federal level and then the provincial level. And having grown up in Port Alberni in the 1970s and 80s, so we're close to the same age, and I grew up in a small town with a fairly large Indigenous population, and a very different way in which, Caucasian people, Indigenous people engage with each other back then versus now. I think it's a lot more peaceful than it was when I was a kid. And so I look at reconciliation, and I think, well, it seems like I used that word greenwashing earlier, which I can't say. I mean, I'm a big fan of the environment, and I don't like greenwashing, especially by big corporations. And I think to myself, for all this talk about reconciliation, we still don't have Indigenous people at the table when it comes to forming policies and law. And you would get this because you're a lawyer. Yeah. Now, in New Zealand, it's actually mandated. There are, I don't remember how many, like 4 seats or so within their parliament that are dedicated to the Indigenous people of New Zealand. And I have thought to myself, like, what better way to have legitimate reconciliation than to provide guaranteed seats at the, in Victoria or in Ottawa to the Indigenous people? How many people, the Indigenous people today in Canada, what do they represent as their total population?
It's It's quite small, and part of the problem with nailing it down to a specific number is that non-status Indians and Métis people are not closely tracked by the federal government.
Okay.
So the numbers, could vary.
Throw me a number though.
8%? I'd say it's less than 8%.
Less than 8?
Yeah.
I heard 6.3.
Yeah, like 5% was kind of where I was going to land.
Okay.
But it could be as high as 10. That's the problem, right? And
Right. Well, okay, let's do some simple math.
Yeah.
So let's say it's 6%. Well, let's say we all agree it's 6%.
Sure.
And let's say for simple math, there's 100 seats in provincially. There's like 89 or something like that. Let's just say for simple math, it's 100. That would mean that there should be 6 dedicated seats to represent that population base. To me, that's reconciliation. That's saying we're going to take a colonial system and insert the population base of the Indigenous people a guaranteed spot. They get to have a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm.
Now in New Zealand, they changed legislation there. I don't know how many years ago, but they made it mandatory or obligatory for the Parliament in New Zealand to have a certain number of seats available for their Indigenous people. And so, as someone who's kind of observed this unfold over the last 5 or 10 years, it seems to me crazy that we do all this talk around reconciliation, but we've never given the people who we're trying to reconcile with a damn seat at the table. Talking about giving the Indigenous community a guaranteed seat, regardless of how many people may show up to vote within their community, to have a seat in Parliament on Ottawa, or to have a seat within the Legislative Assembly in Victoria, or for that matter, somehow have a say here municipally.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is this something that we can be done? And if we look at it at the municipal level, do you have any ideas around how we could accomplish something like this if you support this idea?
Mm-hmm. Well, so what I could go into great detail about, but I won't because of the length of this podcast, is that there are questions about who are the legitimate owners of the land that makes up Canada. And even the Supreme Court of Canada has written very recently that the title to the land is not apparently legally in favor of Canada. On the other hand, I can't speak for all Indigenous nations, but I could go back to Saskatchewan, where I'm from, and talk to my Cree relatives, and talk to elders in Cree communities, which I've done in the past, and they would say to me, we just want, we don't even care about trying to figure out how much has been lost and everything. We just want to go to what was promised originally, which is cooperation between our peoples and sharing of the responsibility for this land. So that's what you're talking about.
That's pretty genuine
in a real way.
Yeah.
But the question is, what constitutes a fair allotment? And that's where the devil's in the details.
Uh-huh.
But I think that one of the things that Vancouver could be doing, other than having the independent representative for matriarchs, which we talked about, would be finding more ways to bring Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh leadership and the nations into decision making in Vancouver. And also, we can't forget about the urban Indigenous population, people who are also guests on this territory, but Indigenous. There are definitely ways that the municipal government could be doing it up into like you say, specifically allotting seats. But the other really great thing that I found in Vancouver is a lot of people want to see elected Indigenous councillors. They want Indigenous politicians in their politics because they know that things are wrong, and they know that people like me can help to educate and build bridges on these things. And so, this is not municipal, this is federal. But
yes.
I was standing out in the rain in 2021, waving a sign, and this guy comes up on his bicycle and he gets off and he says, I just want to tell you this really quick. He says, I'm in the top tax bracket, so your party is going to make me pay more tax if you win, but What's happening to Indigenous people in this country is a travesty. It's horrendous. And that's why I voted for you in the advanced polls. We need people like you that are speaking truth to power and helping us get out of this mess that we find ourselves in. And then he got on his
That must
bike
have
and
made you feel pretty good.
yeah, he got on his bike and he went on his way. And it's the thing about politics is it gets so polarized, and people get caught on one little thing and then they just completely ignore everything else because, well, I don't agree with this person on this, so I'm just to hell with them, right? I'm out there canvassing and I'm trying to find the common ground that we can work together on, because at the end of the day, I don't care if you're conservative or a communist, we're human beings, and 70%, 80% of what we do is coded in our DNA, and we have this commonality. The other little details, let's sweat those once we really deal with what matters to us. And I'm saying that as a father now, and I'm thinking about the future. So let's all think about the future.
Yeah, well said. There's a risk or a concern, as we talked about with Jean a minute ago, that if we start taxing names like Amazon, her response was, well, we can replace them with smaller industries. But one of my concerns that I have as a Vancouverite myself is that if we make the cost of doing business too high here in Vancouver, and it comes from many levels.
Mm-hmm.
I use even the 25-cent cup tax as a good example of just one of the small million, death by million cuts. So how do we stop people from leaving the city of Vancouver because the cost of living is too high here, not just because of housing, but for all sorts of other things, including taxes?
Yeah, well, I think that, what we need to be looking at is the holistic picture. And I believe that the situation we find ourselves in is in part because we've dug ourselves into a hole. Not just us in Vancouver, but the federal government and the provincial government have helped get us there. And I think that a lot of it has to do with too much ideology and people getting so caught up in like, this is my position and this is where I stand and it's the hill I'm going to die on, that they don't look at, there are compromises. There are ways to make things happen. So talking about Amazon, businesses that are transitioning from startup to mid-sized businesses don't have a home in Vancouver. We need to find ways for them to have a home in Vancouver, because that's
common feedback I actually hear. You're absolutely right.
It'll help our economy immensely.
It's kind of that Walmart effect. Like you put a Walmart into a community and everybody gets access to all these cheap goods at monster, volume, but the small businesses around them that previously sold goods they all disappear.
Yeah. And, when we look across the border at where Amazon's coming from, those cities have dug themselves in that much deeper in the hole. And that's why Amazon is coming over to us. It's safer and it's cheaper here. And that's saying something when they're leaving American cities to come to Canada. We don't want to continue that trend and become further dug in.
Right.
Amazon, I think they're willing to pay a little more if it's good for them in the long run. I think that we shouldn't be suggesting that improving our communities will drive businesses away. If we do it right and we do it smart, it will encourage them to remain. It'll encourage more to come.
Okay. Even if you had all four elected, you still wouldn't have a majority. So what are some of the other, there's 9 parties running here, Breen. So out of the other 8, what are some of the other parties that you see yourself aligned with?
Well, I'll tell you the parties I don't see myself aligned with. How about we do that?
Sure.
I'm not aligned with any party that justifies the police having 20% of the city budget. I am not aligned with those people. I look at Calgary or Toronto or Ottawa or Quebec City, where their police budgets are roughly half of what we're spending, and they're managing just fine. And in some cases, they're doing better than us in terms of managing crime rates. I think that the situation that we've got is that we are spending an obscene amount on police. And, two of those councillors are married to police officers. So I just can't get behind that. I just can't. Fiscal responsibility to me is looking at our emergency services and trying to achieve parity between the fire budget and the police budget. I think if those two budgets are closer to each other, then we're doing a lot better as a city. And then that's freeing up resources to be proactive about the social issues in our city instead of being reactive, which is what we're doing with police.
Okay. We're going to now finally switch to our favorite topic, which is financial accountability. So Jean, you've proposed, and you mentioned this earlier, a mansion tax, a tax of 1% on the assessed value of mansions between $5 to $10 million, and then an extra 2% on any homes that are valued over $10 million. By my math, that means that a person living, say, in a $25 million home today, which pays about $67,000 a year in property taxes, not including the school tax that's a add-on by the provincial government, would go from paying $67,000 a year in property taxes to nearly $500,000 a year in property taxes. Is the current rate of tax not high enough as it is?
Well, if you got a $25 million house, you got a lot of options that renters, that homeless people, that people that have a $2 million house don't have. You have an awful lot of options. I don't think your figures are right because we, first of all, what we're asking for is the right to have a progressive property tax. That could happen in a whole bunch of different ways. One way it could happen would be a way that you suggested. But when we did the numbers on it, for people that have, say, a house that's worth $6 million, they'd only pay the extra tax on the $1 million. And if it's a $25 million house, they'd only pay the extra tax on the 15 million that was over the 10 million. So it wouldn't be that high.
Okay.
But yeah, so if you can defer your taxes. A lot of people can defer taxes under all kinds of situations. If you have kids, if you're old, if you have disability. And so your heirs won't get as much money, but property wealth is one of the big reasons that we have so much inequality in the city and in the province and in the country. And if we can equalize that a little bit, so much the better, particularly if we can use the money to do something like end homelessness.
Right. Okay. Now, with respect to, you mentioned it's the idea of progressive tax, but do you have a structure in place today that you'd like to see implemented?
Well, that was one example.
Okay.
Like, I would like to do it. That's just for residential too.
Okay.
So what if we did it for commercial too? What if we taxed Amazon at a higher rate than we taxed, a local coffee shop that isn't Starbucks?
Yeah.
What if we taxed Starbucks based on all of the properties that they own? Right?
Yeah. Would there be any fear of seeing businesses like Amazon leaving if their tax structure is too high?
Well, then we'd have to have local businesses doing what they do, and would that be bad?
Right. Yeah, sure.
I think that would be good.
Yeah.
And if I can jump in too, a lot of smaller businesses and startups are saying that there's no place for them in the middle. So they start up, and then because of the treatment that Amazon's getting, but there's not a lot of focus on the middle, they end up having to leave Vancouver. Yeah. So we're constantly cycling businesses and startups out, and these people are saying, why are you favoring all these big businesses but completely ignoring the middle? Yeah. And it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I want to ask one more question if I can, please.
Okay.
The City of Vancouver's annual operating budget is $1.7 billion. If you look at the city's balance sheet between financial assets and non-financial assets, there's almost $8 billion of assets there. Now, as elected officials for the City of Vancouver, and one of your responsibilities is overseeing these assets and this cash cycle of $1.7 billion annually. For our listeners to understand, how can they be confident knowing that you have the skill sets and the knowledge to be able to look after these financial assets?
Well, they just have to keep on our case. That's all I can think of. The city is not in a good place when it comes to this stuff, you know. The city has 8% of the revenue. We have 60% of the infrastructure that we have to build and keep in good repair. Our sewers, you know, we're getting climate change. Sea level is rising. That's going to mean we have to really change our sewers because they're depending on gravity. How are we going to get the money for this? Please give us a mansion tax. You know, we desperately need some good sources of revenue to be able to fulfill our responsibilities, particularly with climate change coming. So, and particularly in order to fulfill our responsibilities to keep the greenhouse gases down.
Yeah.
That's going to take money too. So, yeah, it is a bit of a learning curve when you get elected, but yeah, the only way you can, voters can be sure that their candidates are doing what they want is to keep on their tails.
So if people like what they hear between you and Jean and they want to get involved, how do they get involved? What are you looking for? Where can you use help? Is it for donations, volunteer time?
Yeah, well, all of that, right? Every political party is asking for money right now. It's something that I've gotten quite used to now that this is my third time campaigning. You don't have to give a lot to make a big difference. I mean, some people have. You know, if you've got $1,200 to throw at your candidates, then go ahead. We'll take your money and we'll thank you very much for it. And it's not going to your candidate. It's going to what matters to you. It's going to the person you're trying to vote in so that they can do at city council what you want done. It's funny. Some people think that the candidate is somehow gaining an advantage from political donations, and no, the candidate's not getting paid. But $5, $20 can make a huge difference if enough people do it. And then volunteering, absolutely.
Do you guys have a campaign office?
We don't have a campaign office yet.
Website?
But the website, copevancouver.ca.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Jean Swanson, thank you very much for being in today. Breen, Ouellette, thank you. Good luck with your campaign and best of luck on October 15th.